My daughter called at 2 in the morning. "Dad, please come get me." Her voice was a terrified whisper before the line went completely dead. When I arrived at her in-law's house in Lake Forest, her mother-in-law blocked the front door with a cold smile and said she is not leaving. I did not argue. I forced my way in. When I saw my daughter lying unconscious on the marble floor, with fresh injuries on her arms, my blood started to boil. I am Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I have spent 40 years building a real estate empire from the ground up right here in Chicago. I always thought my wealth could protect my family. I thought my daughter Harper had married a decent man. But what I uncovered over the next few weeks was a betrayal so vicious, so calculated, that I had to burn their entire world to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that a father's duty to protect his child never ends, no matter how old they get. I did not knock when I reached the massive mahogany double doors of the house I had purchased for them. The house my money had built. Beatrice Davies, my son-in-law's mother, stood in the entryway. She wore a silk robe and a look of supreme arrogance. She crossed her arms, blocking my path, and told me Harper was having an episode. She told me Harper was not leaving. I am a man who has negotiated with the most cutthroat developers in the state of Illinois. I have crushed labor strikes, outmaneuvered corporate raiders, and stood face-to-face with mayors and governors. I do not negotiate with parasites. I did not waste my breath on Beatrice. I simply raised my solid brass walking cane and swung it directly into the custom-stained glass pane of the front door. The glass shattered, raining down on the imported rug in a million glittering pieces. Beatrice shrieked and leaped backward. I stepped through the broken frame, my heavy boots crunching on the glass. I shoved past her with my shoulder, ignoring her hysterical threats to call the police. I welcomed the police. In fact, I prayed they would come. I found Harper in the formal living room. My beautiful 28-year-old girl, the sole heir to a $50 million trust fund I had established to secure her future, was lying motionless on the cold marble floor. Her skin was terrifyingly pale, almost translucent under the harsh glow of the crystal chandelier. Her breathing was shallow, a faint ragged sound that tore at my chest. I dropped to my knees beside her, my joints aching from the sudden movement, but I pushed the physical pain away. I grabbed her wrist to feel for a pulse. That was when I saw the bruises. Dark purplish marks wrapped entirely around her pale forearm. They were not the chaotic scrapes of a clumsy fall. They were precise. They were the distinct overlapping ovals of human fingers gripping with violent force. Someone had grabbed her, dragged her, or restrained her against her will. My hands shook, not from the frailty of age, but from a sudden volcanic surge of absolute rage. Footsteps pounded down the grand, sweeping staircase. Preston, my son-in-law, practically threw himself into the room. He was wearing perfectly wrinkled pajama pants and a casually unbuttoned shirt. His hair was ruffled just enough to look chaotic, but his breathing was remarkably steady. Too steady. "Dad, oh my God! Richard, thank God you are here!" Preston gasped, dropping to his knees on the other side of Harper. He reached his hand out, aiming for her shoulder, his face twisting into a mask of pure, frantic concern. I have spent 4 decades pouring concrete and erecting skyscrapers across the Chicago skyline. When you spend a lifetime in construction, you learn how to spot a crumbling foundation long before the building ever falls. You learn to recognize when something is structurally compromised just by looking at the surface tension. Preston's panic was structurally compromised. The pitch of his voice was slightly too loud. The widening of his eyes was almost theatrical. It was a performance, a perfectly rehearsed act for an audience of one. Me. As his hand descended toward my daughter, I did not hesitate. I snapped my brass cane up the heavy metal tip, cracking sharply against Preston's wrist. He recoiled, yelping in genuine surprise and pain, clutching his hand to his chest. He looked up at me, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second, to reveal a flash of cold, calculating fury, before the panicked husband routine snapped rigidly back into place. "Do not touch her," I said. My voice was low, devoid of any shouting, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. "Richard, I am her husband," Preston stammered, his eyes darting toward his mother, who was now lingering nervously in the archway. She fell. She just completely lost her balance and fell down the stairs. I tried to catch her. You know how she has been lately. The stress, it is just too much for her. I kept my eyes locked on his. I did not look at the grand staircase behind him. I did not look at Beatrice hovering in the shadows. I stared directly into the hollow, empty eyes of the man who was supposed to protect my only child. "We will see what the paramedics say," I replied evenly. I had already pressed the emergency alert on my phone the moment I saw her on the floor. The distant wail of sirens was already piercing the quiet night air of the affluent neighborhood. Preston's jaw clenched, the muscles feathered under his cheek. I could see the gears turning in his head, calculating his next move. Beatrice hurried forward, her silk robe billowing around her ankles. "Richard, you are making a scene. We can handle this privately. Harper just needs to rest in her own bed. You are completely overreacting." I slowly stood up, leaning my heavy weight onto my cane. I looked at Beatrice, a woman who carried designer bags she could not afford, living in a house she did not own, looking down her nose at the man paying for the very electricity keeping her lights on. "If you open your mouth again, Beatrice, I will ensure you spend the rest of your life living in a cardboard box under the Kennedy Expressway," I said quietly. She clamped her mouth shut, her face draining of color. The flashing red and white lights of the ambulance threw violent rhythmic shadows across the walls of the grand foyer. Two paramedics rushed through the shattered doorway, their heavy boots tracking glass dust onto the hardwood floors. They dropped their heavy medical bags next to Harper and immediately went to work. One checked her pupils with a penlight, while the other began taking her blood pressure. In an instant, Preston transformed again. The cold, calculating man vanished, replaced entirely by the desperate, weeping spouse. He hovered over the paramedics as they checked her vitals, wringing his hands, his voice trembling with manufactured agony. "Please, you have to help her," Preston begged, grabbing the sleeve of the lead paramedic. "She has been under so much pressure. She manages her late mother's charity foundation, and the stress has just broken her. She has been exhibiting severe mental instability all week. I think she might have mixed her antidepressants with a large amount of wine. I tried to stop her, but she was hallucinating. She just slipped and fell down the entire flight of stairs." I stood silent in this corner of the room, watching the paramedics absorb his narrative. They nodded sympathetically, their demeanor shifting. They were no longer looking at a potential crime scene. Thanks to Preston's carefully chosen words, they were looking at a tragic medical accident caused by a fragile woman's psychological breakdown. He had instantly controlled the environment, planting the seed of doubt about my daughter's sanity, before she even had a chance to wake up and speak for herself. I looked at the bruises on her arms. I looked at the pristine, unbruised state of her legs and head, which made a violent tumble down a solid oak staircase highly improbable. I knew he was lying. I knew this was an elaborate illusion. But as they lifted my daughter onto the stretcher, and Preston climbed into the back of the ambulance, holding her hand, acting the part of the devoted savior, I realized something chilling. In the cutthroat world of commercial real estate, the most fatal mistake you can make is showing your opponent that you know they are lying before you have the leverage to crush them. Preston was establishing a perimeter. He was building a defensive wall out of medical jargon and fake empathy. If I swung my cane at him now, if I yelled to the paramedics that he was a liar and a monster, I would be the one escorted out by the police. He would file a restraining order. He would become the sole medical proxy for my daughter, and I would be locked out of her life permanently. He wanted me to react. He wanted an emotional outburst to prove his point, that the Caldwell family was mentally unstable. I refused to give it to him. I slowed my breathing. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction. I let my hand tremble slightly as it rested on my cane. I became the helpless 70-year-old father he desperately needed me to be. The hunt had begun, but for now I would let him believe he was the apex predator. The sterile smell of bleach and floor wax at Chicago General Hospital hit me the moment I walked through the sliding glass doors. I hated hospitals. I had spent 3 agonizing months in a place like this, watching my wife fade away. Now I was standing in the harsh fluorescent glare of the emergency wing, watching my daughter fight for her life behind a set of swinging double doors. Preston paced the waiting area. He had his hands buried in his messy hair, muttering to himself, playing the role of a man completely broken by tragedy. He was exceptionally good. I had to give him that. In my 40 years of navigating the ruthless commercial real estate business, I have seen desperate men lie for millions of dollars, but Preston was putting on an absolute masterclass. 2 uniformed police officers walked into the quiet waiting room. Their heavy boots squeaked loudly on the linoleum. This was standard operating procedure for any severe household injury. Preston immediately rushed toward them, before I could even take a single step forward. He introduced himself as the husband, his voice thick with tears. I stepped closer. I leaned heavily on my solid brass cane, letting my shoulders hunch. I made sure I looked exactly like a frightened, confused old man who desperately needed to hear what the authorities were saying. Before the officers could ask their second question, the sliding doors hissed open again. Beatrice swept into the room. She had changed into a somber gray pantsuit, looking every bit the concerned matriarch. She walked to the officers, her face a picture of maternal anguish. She introduced herself and immediately opened her expensive leather handbag. Her hands trembled a calculated touch as she pulled out 3 orange plastic cylinders. She placed the empty prescription bottles on the small table between the officers. These were on her nightstand. Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking perfectly. I found them when I went to get her things. The taller officer picked up a bottle, reading the label. Antidepressants. Sedatives. Preston let out a choked sob and looked at the police officers with absolute despair. It is my fault, he said slowly, shaking his head. I should have seen how bad it was getting. She has been under so much relentless pressure since her mother passed away. My wife manages the Caldwell Family Charity Foundation. It is a massive responsibility. The overwhelming stress has been eating her alive for months. She started hiding her pain. I stood there gripping the handle of my cane so hard my knuckles turned stark white. My daughter was the strongest woman I knew. She ran that massive foundation with ruthless efficiency. She was not fragile. Preston was spinning a web of deceit so tight the police were already nodding in sympathy. Tonight, it just finally boiled over. Preston continued wiping a remarkably dry eye. She locked herself in her bedroom and opened a bottle of red wine. I tried to talk to her to calm her down, but she was entirely incoherent. She must have taken the pills with the alcohol. She started hallucinating, screaming. She bolted for the door, stumbled on the top step, and went tumbling down the staircase. I tried to catch her. I swear to you, I really tried. My heart hammered against my ribs like a sledgehammer. Red wine. He specifically said she drank red wine. My daughter Harper has suffered from a severe documented alcohol allergy since the day she turned 18. Even a tiny sip of wine causes her throat to swell. She has not touched a single drop of alcohol in 10 long years. Preston made a massive error in his story. But I could not say a word. If I called him a liar, I would simply sound like a man in deep denial, a grieving father stubbornly refusing to accept his daughter's mental illness. Right on cue, a man in a tailored suit and white lab coat walked rapidly down the hallway. He carried a leather briefcase and an air of unquestionable medical authority. Beatrice gasped in staged relief and reached out to him. It was Dr. Aris, a high-priced private physician who catered exclusively to the wealthy elites of the North Shore. I knew his dark reputation. He was a corrupt doctor who willingly provided discreet medical records for the right price. He was entirely on Beatrice's payroll. Dr. Aris shook hands with the police officers and smoothly took over the conversation. He pulled a thick medical file from his briefcase. He spoke in calm, measured tones, throwing around heavy medical jargon that immediately commanded respect. He confirmed that Harper had been his patient for the past 6 months. He detailed a completely fabricated history of severe anxiety, acute depressive episodes, and a fragile mental state severely exacerbated by grief. He stated definitively that the combination of her prescribed medication and alcohol would undoubtedly cause violent hallucinations and a complete loss of motor control. I watched the 2 police officers visibly relax. The tension completely left their broad shoulders. They were no longer looking for a dangerous criminal. They were looking at a tragic, unfortunate medical accident. The younger officer glanced at me. His eyes were soft, filled with that sickening pity people reserve for the elderly who cannot comprehend a sudden tragedy. It was the condescending look you give to someone who is simply too old and too frail to handle the harsh truth. The older officer closed his small black notebook and clicked his pen shut. He placed a heavy, comforting hand on Preston's shoulder. "I am very sorry for what your family is going through tonight, sir," he said quietly. "The medical staff is doing absolutely everything they can. If you need anything else, you have our contact card. But as far as we are concerned, this was a terribly tragic accidental fall caused by an adverse medical reaction. We will absolutely not be pursuing a criminal investigation." The police turned and walked out the sliding glass doors, taking my only immediate avenue for justice with them. The trap had firmly slammed shut. Legally, I was absolutely nothing. Preston was her lawful husband. He held her entire medical proxy. He possessed the ultimate authority over her care, her visitors, and her physical location. If I raised my cane right now, if I shouted the undeniable truth at the top of my lungs, the hospital security guards would forcefully drag me out. Preston would instantly file a permanent restraining order against me, citing my aggressive and irrational behavior. I would be legally and permanently barred from ever coming within 100 miles of my own flesh and blood. I swallowed the burning bile rising in my throat. I let my weary shoulders sag even further down. I slowly looked at Preston, allowing my eyes to appear incredibly watery and completely defeated. I absolutely had to let him truly believe he had won this preliminary battle so that I could ultimately win the entire war. I had to quietly step backward into the dark shadows and patiently prepare to completely dismantle his entire miserable existence. He would pay for this betrayal. The heavy hospital doors hissed open again, breaking the thick silence of the emergency department. Preston walked slowly out of the restricted medical bay, his posture meticulously engineered to project complete physical and emotional exhaustion. He spotted me sitting alone in the uncomfortable vinyl chair and immediately altered his trajectory, heading straight toward me. The few late-night nurses and exhausted patients in the sterile waiting room completely ignored us, utterly unaware of the high-stakes, psychological war silently unfolding in their midst. He closed the distance between us, his arms extended, and pulled me into a tight, suffocating embrace before I could even raise my heavy brass cane to stop him. I forced my rigid muscles to relax, forcing my body to accept the sickening physical contact of the man who had undoubtedly just tortured my only child, Dad. "I am so deeply glad you are still here," Preston whispered, his voice trembling with a perfectly manufactured, agonizing emotion that echoed softly off the pale walls. He pulled back slowly, keeping both of his strong hands firmly planted on my drooping shoulders, looking deeply and earnestly into my eyes. "I promised to protect her with my very life, Richard. You know I did. I stood proudly before you and Lillian on our beautiful wedding day and solemnly swore before God that I would always keep her safe. It genuinely breaks my heart into a million pieces to see her suffering like this tonight. She just needs absolute rest. She needs absolute quiet to let her broken mind heal. The specialized doctors are telling me her mind is incredibly fragile right now, teetering on a dangerous edge. You really should go home. Your heart simply cannot take this kind of immense, unexpected stress at your advanced age. Let me handle all of this." I am her lawful husband. I will stay faithfully by her side every single agonizing second until she is fully recovered. He was actively dismissing me. He was cleverly cloaking his ruthless banishment in the highly deceptive guise of deep familial concern. He desperately wanted me completely out of the building, far away from Harper, far away from any chance of me asking the doctors dangerous questions. I looked down at his feet. Even in the chaotic middle of a supposed midnight medical catastrophe, his expensive Italian leather loafers were impeccably polished. They gleamed brightly under the harsh buzzing hospital lights, without a single scuff or speck of dust to betray his fabricated panic. My late wife Lillian had explicitly warned me about him exactly 3 years ago. We were hosting a massive, incredibly lavish charity gala at the historic Drake Hotel, and Preston was busy aggressively charming the entire room full of wealthy investors. Lillian had gently leaned close to me, her sharp, intuitive eyes scanning his rigid, perfect posture and his bright, heavily practiced smile. She told me to look closely at his immaculate shoes. She said a man who spends that much time meticulously polishing his shoes right before a charity event cares infinitely more about his own reflection than his actual soul. She said he possessed deeply hollow eyes, the terrifying kind of dark, empty eyes that absorbed all surrounding light, but absolutely never reflected any genuine warmth back into the world. I had foolishly dismissed her valid concerns back then. I stubbornly thought she was just being an overly protective, naturally suspicious mother clinging to her only daughter. I thought Preston was simply an ambitious, hungry young man, eager to thoroughly impress his wealthy, powerful future father-in-law. I had spent 40 long, difficult years successfully building a massive commercial real estate empire, constantly evaluating complex character traits and sniffing out terrible business investments. Yet I had completely missed the toxic rot hiding deep inside the man courting my daughter. Lillian saw the terrifying hollow void inside him instantly. Now staring directly into those exact same hollow, lifeless eyes, I felt a sickening, heavy wave of intense guilt wash over me. The stark, undeniable reality of the horrifying situation crashed over me with brutal, terrifying clarity. Preston was not just playing the calculated role of a deeply concerned, loving husband. He was actively, systematically, and ruthlessly trying to completely isolate Harper from the outside world. He was rapidly building an invisible, impenetrable fortress around her hospital bed, cleverly using rigid medical protocol and undeniable spousal privilege as his indestructible bricks and mortar. If I foolishly pushed back right now, if I forcefully demanded to see her immediately or openly accused him of causing those violent, gripping bruises on her pale, delicate arms, the steel trap would spring entirely shut. He currently held all the winning legal cards in his carefully manicured hands. As her lawful, recognized husband, he could simply inform the strict hospital administration that my looming presence was a dangerous, unpredictable trigger for her incredibly fragile mental state. He could legally restrict my access completely, leaving me absolutely powerless. I would be swiftly escorted out by armed hospital security, permanently branded by everyone as a disruptive, unstable, grieving father who simply could not accept sad reality. I would rapidly lose any realistic chance of ever uncovering the dark truth hiding behind his polished facade. To absolutely win this impending war, I had to completely surrender the current battle happening right here in this fluorescent hallway. I had to let him fully believe he was the smartest, most dominant man in the room. I let my tense shoulders drop forward dramatically. I allowed a slight, highly noticeable tremor to enter my hands as I leaned much more heavily onto my carved brass cane. I let out a very long, terribly ragged sigh, forcing my aging eyes to look exceptionally watery and utterly devastatingly defeated. "You are right, Preston," I said, my voice deliberately lowered to a weak, hoarse whisper that perfectly mimicked a broken spirit. "I am just a very tired old man. This tragic night has taken everything out of me. My chest feels incredibly tight and heavy. I do not think I can bear to see my girl lying in a hospital bed, looking so broken and fragile. I desperately need to trust you. I need you to be the remarkably strong man she married. Profound relief rapidly washed over Preston's entire face. It was a microscopic shift, a slight relaxation of his tense jaw muscles, but I caught it instantly. The arrogant predator foolishly believed the wounded prey had simply given up the fight. He squeezed my shoulder affectionately one last time. Do not worry about a thing, Dad. I have everything completely under control here. Go home, get some much-needed sleep. I will call you the absolute second there is any meaningful change in her medical condition. You have my solemn word. I nodded weakly, slowly turning away from him. I shuffled painfully toward the automatic sliding glass doors, intentionally dragging my heavy feet, just a little bit, painting the absolute perfect picture of a frail, beaten father retreating blindly into the freezing, dark, unforgiving Chicago night to plan my absolute revenge. I will destroy him entirely, piece by piece, until nothing remains but ash. I found an empty chair in the far corner of the waiting room, slipping into the shadows just as Preston turned to speak with the admitting nurse. I sat there in silence, a statue of grief watching his every move. He paced the floor, occasionally rubbing his face, keeping up the charade for the medical staff. Beatrice sat nearby, furiously typing on her phone. I waited. In the world of commercial real estate, patience is not just a virtue, it is a weapon. You wait until the opposition makes a logistical error, until they leave a flank completely unguarded. My opportunity arrived 20 minutes later. Preston's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, his posture stiffening, and motioned for Beatrice to follow him down the corridor toward the cafeteria. They needed to coordinate their story privately. As soon as they disappeared around the corner, I pushed myself up from the chair. My fabricated limp vanished entirely. I walked down the sterile hallway with the steady, measured strides of a man who owned the building. I found Harper's room in the intensive care unit. The door was slightly ajar. I slipped inside and closed it silently behind me. The room was cold, smelling faintly of iodine and freshly laundered linens. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound cutting through the heavy silence. I stood at the foot of the bed and looked at my daughter. She looked so small, wrapped in the pale hospital blankets. The vibrant, fiercely intelligent woman who ran a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation had been reduced to a fragile, motionless figure. A thick bandage wrapped around her forehead, hiding whatever damage the impact had caused. An intravenous line fed clear fluid into the back of her hand. I moved closer, pulling up a plastic guest chair, and sat down right beside her. I did not reach out to hold her hand. I did not weep. I needed my mind to remain absolutely clinical. I needed to examine the evidence before the hospital staff covered it up with heavy gauze and medical tape. I leaned over her right arm, which rested outside the blanket. The fluorescent light from the ceiling cast a stark, unforgiving glow over her pale skin. I focused my attention entirely on the dark marks staining her forearm. I have fallen downstairs before. I know exactly what impact contusions look like. When a human body tumbles down a flight of solid oak steps, the bruising is wide, chaotic, and dispersed across the shoulders, the hips, and the prominent joints. Gravity and blunt force trauma do not paint with a fine brush. But the marks on Harper's delicate arm were terrifyingly precise. I leaned in closer, my eyes tracing the dark purple geometry stamped into her flesh. There were 4 distinct, perfectly circular bruises lined up along the tender inner skin of her bicep. Directly opposite them, on the outer curve of her arm, was a single larger, darker contusion. The thumb. It was the undeniable anatomical imprint of a large human hand. Someone had grabbed her with immense punishing force. Someone had restrained her, violently pulling her back or pinning her down while she struggled. A fall cannot create that specific pattern. A staircase does not possess fingers. My blood turned to absolute ice. The image of Preston hovering over her in the foyer, his fake panic, his perfectly polished shoes, flashed through my mind like a strobe light. He had put his hands on her. The realization was a physical blow, a sudden constriction in my chest that momentarily stole my breath. I carefully pulled the blanket back just an inch to inspect her left arm. It bore identical marks. Both of her wrists were ringed with overlapping shadows of green and purple, the desperate signs of a violent struggle. She had fought back against her attacker. She had fought hard until she was somehow rendered unconscious. Then I thought about the meticulously crafted story Preston had delivered to the police officers and the corrupt private doctor. He had spoken with such smooth, rehearsed confidence about her mixing heavy antidepressants with a large amount of red wine. He had painted a tragic picture of a woman spiraling out of control, drowning her professional sorrows in alcohol before suffering a psychotic break. The police had swallowed the narrative whole because it sounded perfectly logical for a stressed executive. But it was a catastrophic lie. It was a fatal flaw in his arrogant, overconfident script, a flaw that only a father would instantly recognize. I stared at the steady green line traversing the heart monitor. Harper has a profound, highly documented, and incredibly dangerous allergy to alcohol. I remember her 18th birthday with terrifying clarity. We were hosting a small celebration at our summer home. A misguided relative offered her a single sip of celebratory champagne. Within 10 minutes, her throat had swelled completely shut. Her skin broke out in furious burning hives, and she collapsed onto the patio. I had to plunge an epinephrine pen directly into her thigh, while my wife frantically called an ambulance. That terrifying night altered her life forever. Harper has never touched a single drop of alcohol since that day. She does not drink red wine to unwind after a long day of managing the charity foundation. She does not drink at social galas, corporate dinners, or private celebrations. She is hyper-vigilant about her severe medical condition. The mere suggestion that she would willingly open a bottle of red wine, let alone drink enough of it to induce a violent, hallucination-fueled psychotic break, was an absolute medical impossibility. It was a complete fabrication manufactured by a man who either forgot her medical history or arrogantly assumed no one would ever bother to double-check his story. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a sickening, terrifying clarity. Preston and his bankrupt mother were spinning a massive coordinated web of deception. They had deliberately lied to the emergency medical technicians. They had lied to the responding police officers. They had brought in a compromised private doctor to validate a completely fictional narrative of mental instability. Harper did not stumble down those stairs in a drunken, medicated haze. She was brutally attacked in her own home. She was violently restrained by the man who had sworn to protect her, and then she was intentionally injured to create a physical trauma that would conveniently match their fabricated story. They were actively constructing a false medical history, building a paper trail of psychiatric fragility and substance abuse. But why? Why would a husband go to such extreme, dangerous lengths to document his wealthy, successful wife as mentally unstable? The question echoed in the quiet, sterile room. In my decades of business, I have learned that when someone creates a complex, high-stakes lie, there is always a massive financial motive buried underneath the surface. They were laying the groundwork for something much larger and infinitely more sinister. I gently pulled the thin hospital blanket back up to her pale chin. I needed to move entirely into the shadows to wage a silent, invisible war against these absolute monsters. The sterile silence of the intensive care unit wrapped around me like a heavy shroud. I sat rigidly in the stiff plastic chair beside my daughter, intensely listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the heart monitor. It was a cold digital reassurance that she was still fighting. I closely watched the slow rise and fall of her chest under the thin white hospital blanket. For a long time, the only movement in the room was the gentle flutter of the curtain near the air vent. I kept my focus locked on her face, searching for any sign of the vibrant, unstoppable woman I had raised. The heavy medication pumping through her intravenous line kept her submerged in a deep, artificial sleep, but I knew she was strong. I simply waited there. In the high-stakes world of commercial real estate development, you learn the profound value of absolute patience. You learn that the foundation must settle completely before you can build the empire. I was prepared to sit in that uncomfortable chair for as many days and nights as it took for her to return to me. I absolutely refused to leave her side for even a fraction of a single solitary second tonight. Suddenly, the steady tempo of the heart monitor began to shift. The slow, rhythmic blips quickened slightly, signaling a change in her physical state. I leaned forward, gripping the smooth wooden handle of my brass cane with both hands. Harper groaned a soft, painful sound that barely parted her dry lips. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the heavy weight of the sedatives. I held my breath, afraid that any sudden movement would pull her back into the darkness. Slowly, agonizingly, her beautiful eyes opened. They were clouded, unfocused at first, staring blankly at the acoustic tiles of the hospital ceiling. Then she slowly turned her head toward the side of the bed. Her gaze found me. The heavy fog of the medication seemed to clear for just a fraction of a second, replaced by a sudden sharp flash of desperate recognition. She knew exactly who I was. She knew her father was sitting right there beside her. A weak, trembling sigh escaped her lips, and her fingers twitched against the crisp white sheets, trying to reach out to me. I moved instantly, sliding to the very edge of the plastic chair. I leaned down until my face was only inches from hers. I kept my voice incredibly low, speaking in a calm, soothing whisper, so I would not startle her. "I am right here, sweetheart," I murmured gently, resting my large, calloused hand over her cold, trembling fingers. "Dad is right here. You are completely safe now." Harper stared at me. The sheer desperation in her eyes was like a physical blow to my chest. It was a silent, agonizing plea for salvation. She parted her lips, struggling violently against the lingering effects of the paralyzing drugs. She was trying to form words, trying to tell me the horrifying truth of what had actually happened in that grand, empty house. I could see the immense physical effort it took for her to draw a breath. I waited, giving her all the time she needed, silently promising her that I would burn the entire city to the ground to protect her. Before she could push the sound past her vocal cords, a sharp, distinct noise pierced the quiet sanctuary of the hospital room. Click, click, click. It was the unmistakable rhythmic striking of expensive designer heels against the polished linoleum floor of the hallway. The sound was growing rapidly louder, marching directly toward our closed door. I recognized that arrogant, heavy footfall immediately. It was Beatrice Davies. In a fraction of a second, the entire atmosphere in the room violently shifted. I felt Harper's hand suddenly turn to absolute ice beneath mine. I watched in absolute horror as a wave of sheer, unadulterated animalistic terror washed completely over my daughter's face. The desperate plea for help vanished instantly, replaced by the raw, paralyzing panic of a hunted creature cornered in a trap. Her eyes widened to an unnatural degree, staring blindly at the wooden door. I used to hunt elk in the dense, freezing woods of Montana during the late autumn months. When you spend enough time silently tracking wildlife through the remote wilderness, you learn to read the subtle, instinctual language of survival. You learn exactly what prey looks like, the exact moment it senses a lethal predator stepping into the clearing. You see the muscles lock. You see the breathing halt. You witness the primal realization that death is imminent. My daughter, a brilliant, powerful executive who routinely commanded boardrooms full of aggressive corporate lawyers, was exhibiting that exact same primal terror. She was absolutely terrified of her own mother-in-law. She was terrified of the people who were supposed to be her family. With a sudden, violent flinch, Harper ripped her hand out from under mine. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut and let her head roll limply back onto the flat pillow. She instantly forced her breathing to slow down, mimicking the shallow, rhythmic cadence of a deep medicated coma. She was playing dead to survive. The heavy wooden door swung open just a few seconds later. Beatrice stood in the threshold, her face carefully arranged into a mask of maternal sorrow. Preston hovered closely behind her, his hollow eyes immediately scanning the room, landing suspiciously on me. I did not move a single muscle. I remained slumped in my chair, staring blankly at the floor, playing the role of the broken, exhausted old man they so desperately needed me to be. "Is there any change, Richard?" Beatrice asked softly, stepping into the room with practiced grace. I slowly lifted my head, making sure my eyes looked weary and defeated. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "She just lies there. The doctors say the medication needs more time to wear off." Preston visibly relaxed his shoulders, dropping a fraction of an inch. "We are here now, Dad. You really should go get some rest." I nodded slowly, heavily pushing myself up with my brass cane. As I shuffled toward the door, every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and shatter his arrogant jaw. But I knew the law. I knew the terrible binding power of a marriage certificate and a medical proxy. If I caused a scene, I would be banished, and Harper would be completely at their mercy. I could not extract her legally without absolute, undeniable proof of their crimes. I desperately needed to uncover their entire toxic network. I needed to know exactly what kind of poison they were feeding her, both metaphorically and literally. I needed to know exactly what I was fighting before I unleashed my total destruction. I slowly walked out of the sterile intensive care unit, the rhythmic clicking of my heavy brass cane echoing loudly in the long, quiet hospital hallway. I was no longer a grieving father. I was a predator quietly fading into the tall grass, preparing for the absolute, unforgiving slaughter. I turned my back on the sterile room and began my slow march down the corridor. I made sure every step was heavy. I dragged my leather shoes across the polished linoleum, creating the distinct rhythmic shuffle of an elderly man whose spirit had been utterly crushed by the night's tragic events. I kept my head bowed, staring at the floorboards, presenting the perfect image of a heartbroken father, completely surrendering to fatigue. The nurses at the central station watched me pass with expressions of profound pity. They saw exactly what Preston wanted them to see. They saw a fading relic who was simply too weak to cope with reality. I walked until I reached the corner intersecting with the elevator lobby, completely disappearing from their line of sight. As soon as the hospital walls shielded me, my posture instantly transformed. I straightened my aching spine. I lifted my chin. The manufactured tremor in my hands vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. I waited in the shadows for 3 full minutes. In the ruthless arena of commercial real estate, you learn that arrogance is the ultimate blind spot. Arrogant men never check their rearview mirrors because they genuinely believe no one is smart enough to follow them. Preston was arrogant. I knew he would not waste a single second once he thought the coast was clear. I turned around and walked back down the hallway. This time I did not shuffle. I moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man accustomed to navigating deadly corporate ambushes. I placed the rubber tip of my brass cane carefully on the floor, ensuring it did not make a single sound. When I reached my daughter's intensive care room, I found the heavy wooden door was still open, just a fraction of an inch. A narrow sliver of harsh fluorescent light spilled out into the dim corridor. I pressed my back flat against the cold wall and carefully positioned my right eye near the gap. The scene unfolding inside confirmed every dark, terrifying instinct that had been screaming in my gut. Beatrice was standing by the window, nervously scanning the parking lot below with her arms tightly crossed. Preston was leaning directly over Harper's fragile, motionless body. The loving, devastated husband routine had completely evaporated. His face was twisted into a mask of cruel, impatient frustration. My daughter was still deeply sedated, her chest rising and falling in a slow, unnatural rhythm. Preston reached down and violently grabbed her limp right arm. He did not touch her with the gentle care of a spouse. He seized her wrist with a brutal, punishing grip, lifting her arm into the air, as if it were nothing more than a lifeless tool. With his other hand, he pulled a sleek black smartphone from his jacket pocket. It was Harper's private phone, the one that contained the primary access codes to her massive charitable foundation and her personal financial accounts. He aggressively pressed the screen, waking up the device. He leaned his face inches from her ear. His voice was a low, venomous hiss, completely devoid of any human warmth. "You are going to make this so incredibly easy for us." He whispered, his words dripping with pure malice. "You are going to hand over every single key, and nobody is going to believe a single word a crazy drunken woman says." With a sudden, forceful motion, he jammed her limp thumb directly onto the biometric sensor of the phone. The screen flashed a bright green, signaling a successful unlock. He immediately began swiping through her private applications with frantic, greedy speed. My blood turned to absolute ice. My heart pounded against my ribs like a war drum. He was actively looting her digital life while she lay defenseless in a hospital bed. Every primal instinct inside my soul demanded that I kick the door off its hinges. I wanted to raise my solid brass cane and shatter his arrogant skull. I wanted to show him exactly what kind of violence a 70-year-old father was truly capable of inflicting. But I forced my burning rage back into the deep, dark vault of my mind. If I attacked him now, I would simply be arrested for assault. He would easily claim he was just checking her messages to notify concerned friends. I needed to play a much longer, far more deadly game. I took a deep breath, letting the mask of the senile, confused old man slide perfectly back over my features. I intentionally scuffed my shoe loudly against the doorframe and pushed the heavy door open. Oh my goodness, my memory is just absolutely terrible these days. I announced, pitching my voice to sound raspy and completely disoriented. Preston violently jumped backward. He dropped Harper's limp arm onto the mattress and hastily shoved the unlocked smartphone deep into his jacket pocket. He spun around to face me, his chest heaving, a flash of genuine panic widening his hollow eyes. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her throat as she spun away from the window. I acted as though I had not seen a single thing. I blinked rapidly, looking around the room with a vague, helpless smile. "I am so terribly sorry to interrupt you both," I stammered, raising a trembling hand to my forehead. I got all the way down to the hospital lobby and realized I had completely forgotten my heavy winter coat. It is so very cold outside tonight, and my old bones simply cannot take the freezing Chicago wind anymore. Preston stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. He was frantically searching my weathered face for any microscopic sign of suspicion, any hint that I had witnessed his brutal digital theft. I gave him nothing. I just stood there, swaying slightly on my cane, looking at my dark wool coat draped over the visitor chair. I let a foolish, apologetic smile stretch across my face. The tension in Preston's rigid shoulders slowly began to dissolve. His panicked breathing returned to a normal, steady rhythm. The arrogant predator had evaluated the threat and concluded there was absolutely nothing to fear. He genuinely believed he had fooled me. He let out a soft, patronizing chuckle and quickly walked over to the chair. He picked up my coat and draped it gently over my shoulders, smoothing the fabric with fake, sickening affection. "You really need to be more careful, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with condescending warmth. "We certainly cannot have you getting sick too. Harper is going to need you to be strong when she finally wakes up. Let me walk you to the elevators to make sure you get down safely. You clearly need to get home and rest your mind." "Thank you, Preston," I whispered, patting his hand with trembling fingers. "You are a good boy." I let him escort me down the hall. He thought he had completely won. He thought I was just a harmless, fading ghost. He had no idea that by taking the bait, he had just signed his own absolute death warrant. The game had moved into the shadows. The hospital elevator's doors slid shut, sealing me inside the descending metal box. My hunched posture immediately vanished. I straightened my back, feeling the familiar cold fire of absolute resolve burning in my chest. I walked out of the hospital lobby and stepped into the freezing Chicago air. The valet brought my black sedan. I tipped him heavily and slid behind the steering wheel. I did not drive toward my empty estate. I drove straight into the heart of the financial district. I needed a specific kind of weapon tonight, and I knew exactly where to find it, waiting patiently. For 40 years, I had built a massive commercial real estate empire by being utterly relentless. I did not amass a spectacular fortune by playing fair or offering second chances to my enemies. When corporate rivals tried to undercut my developments, I did not just beat them in the boardroom. I systematically dismantled their entire infrastructure. I found their hidden debts. I bought their loans. I starved them of capital until they begged for mercy. I was a predator in a tailored suit. I had purposely shelved that ruthless version of myself when Harper took over the family charitable foundation. I wanted my daughter to see a generous, loving father who built things rather than destroyed them. But Preston had just forced that buried monster to claw its way entirely out of a long retirement. I was now aiming that exact same heavy corporate artillery directly at my very own treacherous, corrupt son. I guided my car down the steep concrete ramp into the secure underground parking garage of a towering steel monolith. It housed the absolute most elite corporate business entities. I parked in a dark, reserved spot located near the restricted private executive elevator and killed the engine. I reached into the spacious trunk and pulled out a heavy black leather briefcase. It contained exactly $500,000 in untraceable sequential $100 bills. I always kept a liquid contingency fund available for catastrophic corporate emergencies, and my only child fighting for her life was the ultimate emergency. I took the private elevator directly up to the top floor. The steel doors opened silently into the sleek, aggressively modern reception area of Mitchell, Reed & Associates. Mitchell was absolutely not a standard attorney. He was a highly specialized, spectacularly expensive crisis manager working exclusively for desperate billionaires. He cleaned up catastrophic messes, erased massive liabilities, and unearthed the deepest, darkest secrets of anyone foolish enough to threaten his high-net-worth clients. The midnight receptionist did not ask for my name or my business. She simply nodded respectfully and escorted me down the long, silent corridor leading to his corner office. Mitchell was sitting calmly behind a massive slab of polished obsidian, nursing a glass of dark amber whiskey. He was a sharp, clinical man with silver hair and penetrating eyes that missed absolutely nothing in this world. He did not look surprised to see me tonight. Men in his specific, highly secretive line of work always expected the unexpected from their wealthy clients. "Richard," he said quietly, placing his heavy crystal glass perfectly onto a leather coaster. "To what do I owe the unique pleasure of this highly irregular late-night visit?" I did not waste any time with polite pleasantries. I walked directly to the front of his desk and violently dropped the heavy black briefcase onto the polished obsidian surface. The sudden metallic thud echoed loudly in the cavernous office. I popped the shiny brass latches and flipped the thick leather lid completely open. The neat, tight stacks of crisp currency sat proudly in perfect, undisturbed rows. "This is a preliminary retainer, Mitchell," I said, keeping my tense voice incredibly flat and completely devoid of any human emotion. "I need you to deploy every single resource at your immediate disposal tonight. I want you to actively strip the Davies family down to their absolute bare bones. I want their private bank records. I want their hidden corporate assets. I want their buried personal secrets. I want their worst, most unforgivable sins delivered directly to me before the end of this very long, terrible week." Mitchell leaned forward slightly, his incredibly sharp eyes methodically scanning the massive pile of green cash before looking slowly up at my rigid face. He quietly steepled his long fingers together. He fully knew my only daughter had unfortunately married into the corrupt Davies family. He instantly knew I was officially authorizing a full-scale, devastating nuclear strike against my incredibly corrupt, evil son. He did not ask for my personal reasoning. He simply processed the violent directive with cold, terrifying efficiency. "Preston Davies is a very careful, calculating man, Richard," Mitchell finally said, his deep tone accurately measuring reality. "He actively operates a highly complex, exceptionally shadowy portfolio of aggressive venture capital investments. If my elite private investigators start aggressively poking around his offshore financial networks and secured corporate accounts, we run a very high, incredibly real risk of triggering automatic security alerts within his systems. If he consistently monitors his digital perimeters as closely as I strongly suspect he does, he will instantly know that someone is actively hunting him down. Let him firmly know, I replied instantly, my angry voice dropping a dark, heavy octave. Let him intensely feel the sudden, terrifying shift in the atmospheric pressure. I want him constantly looking over his weak shoulder every single solitary second of the upcoming day. But you must firmly find the absolute undeniable proof of his vast deception before he can completely cover his treacherous tracks forever. Mitchell nodded slowly and deliberately, reaching out to softly close the heavy leather briefcase. He securely locked the shiny brass latches with a definitive, highly satisfying click that echoed throughout the spacious room. "Consider the hunt officially initiated tonight, Richard," he said quietly. I slowly turned around and walked proudly out of the large office, stepping completely back into the darkness. I quickly descended in the private elevator and returned to my waiting vehicle. The brutal frozen wind whipped fiercely against my face as I opened the heavy car door, but I felt absolutely nothing. The immense, agonizing pain of seeing my deeply wounded daughter had finally hardened into pure, indestructible titanium. I slowly steered the black sedan onto the empty, illuminated city streets, driving methodically toward my sprawling, silent estate. Preston foolishly thought he had successfully isolated Harper by constructing a fortress of medical lies. He did not realize I was actively building a ruthless siege engine to destroy it. I would relentlessly peel back every single layer of his fake, glamorous life until the ugly, venomous truth was entirely exposed. The long drive home felt incredibly short as my sharp mind actively organized the next critical steps of my covert operation. Mitchell was currently launching his digital hounds, tearing through secure, encrypted servers. Meanwhile, I had to physically maintain the humiliating illusion of a weak, powerless old man. Tomorrow I would return to that sterile hospital and smile at the devil holding my daughter hostage. Let the predator believe he is safe. The executioner is now coming for him. Exactly 3 agonizing days later, the massive iron gates of the Davies estate swung smoothly shut, securely locking my beautiful daughter behind their towering, impenetrable stone walls. Harper had been officially discharged from the intensive care unit under Preston's strict, unquestionable medical directive. He had aggressively cited the intense media scrutiny and the overwhelming stress of the hospital environment as his primary reasons for moving her to a private, heavily guarded recovery suite within his sprawling mansion. The corrupt private doctor had enthusiastically approved the sudden transfer, completely bypassing any standard psychiatric holds or mandatory police interviews. Preston was now firmly in absolute control of her physical environment, effectively transforming his luxurious home into a gilded, high-security prison. I knew I could not simply storm the heavily fortified gates with a team of expensive lawyers. I needed to establish an invisible, indestructible line of communication directly into the heart of their dark, venomous operation. I needed a flawless Trojan horse. I spent 48 hours systematically utilizing the deepest, most secretive connections within my corporate security network. I reached out to a former intelligence contractor who specialized in highly illegal, untraceable corporate espionage. I commissioned a masterpiece of functional deception. It was a heavy, custom-made, solid gold-plated air purification unit. The exterior was an absolute marvel of modern, ostentatious design, gleaming with undeniable wealth and ridiculous, over-the-top luxury. It was exactly the kind of shiny, tasteless, incredibly expensive object that would instantly appeal to the bottomless, shallow greed of Beatrice Davies. However, the true value of the machine was carefully hidden deep inside the heavy reinforced casing. The contractor had meticulously installed a military-grade satellite listening device complete with a completely standalone high-capacity lithium battery that could easily broadcast crystal-clear audio for 6 continuous months. It bypassed all local wireless networks, transmitting a heavily encrypted signal directly to a secure server located in my private soundproof basement study. I loaded the heavy gleaming machine into the spacious trunk of my vehicle and drove slowly toward the sprawling Davies estate. The imposing iron gates loomed in the distance, flanked by highly visible security cameras and aggressively armed private guards. I rolled down my tinted window and offered the stern guard a weak, trembling smile, intentionally letting my hands shake slightly on the leather steering wheel. I announced that I was the concerned father, bringing a special medical gift for my recovering daughter. The guard coldly verified my identity and allowed the heavy iron gates to slowly grind open. I parked near the grand entrance and carefully retrieved the heavy box from the trunk. I dragged my feet across the smooth cobblestone driveway, breathing with a labored, heavy wheeze, playing the absolute perfect role of a doting, entirely oblivious, physically exhausted old man, simply trying to help his sick child breathe a little bit easier. Preston quickly opened the massive oak front door before I could even reach the top of the wide marble steps. He was wearing perfectly tailored casual gray slacks and a crisp white linen shirt, looking every bit the relaxed, highly attentive husband. However, his hollow, lifeless eyes instantly narrowed with sharp, undeniable suspicion as he stared at the heavy golden box secured tightly in my trembling arms. I offered him a wide, foolish grin, deliberately letting my hunched shoulders sag forward with exaggerated fatigue. I stepped past him into the massive, echoing foyer. The house was painfully quiet, entirely devoid of any natural warmth or joyful human life. I asked to see my beautiful girl, keeping my raspy voice small and incredibly fragile. Preston smoothly blocked my path to the grand staircase, gently placing a firm, patronizing hand on my upper arm. He softly explained that Harper was currently resting after a very difficult, highly traumatic morning, and that the private nurses had requested absolute undisturbed silence. Beatrice suddenly appeared from the formal dining room, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of her expensive designer heels echoing loudly against the polished marble floor. She was holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, looking down her sharp nose at my hunched, pathetic figure. I instantly shifted my focus to her, intentionally allowing my weary eyes to widen with profound, manufactured desperation. I slowly lifted the heavy, gleaming gold air purifier, letting the bright foyer lights catch the highly reflective, expensive metallic surface. I brought this specifically for my little girl's delicate lungs. I wheezed loudly, pausing to take a deep, dramatic, struggling breath that rattled terribly in my chest. The hospital air is just so terribly dry and completely full of dangerous bacteria. This is a very special custom-built medical-grade purifier. It is plated in solid 24-karat gold to naturally eliminate all airborne pathogens. I wanted her to have the absolute best, most luxurious care possible while she rests in your beautiful, massive home. I watched the exact moment Beatrice swallowed the poisonous bait. Her sharp, calculating eyes instantly locked onto the gleaming, heavy gold casing. The inherent, bottomless greed completely overpowered her natural, venomous suspicion. I saw the rapid, shallow calculation flashing across her sharp features as she instantly evaluated the ridiculous, absurd monetary value of the shiny, heavy object I was holding. She slowly stepped forward, pushing past her tense son, and reached out with her manicured hands. She offered me a tight, incredibly fake smile that stretched the tight skin around her mouth. "That is remarkably generous of you, Richard," she said, her voice dripping with artificial, sugary sweetness. "I will personally ensure this beautiful machine is placed directly beside her bed immediately. It will be incredibly helpful for her very long, difficult recovery. We simply want the absolute best for our precious Harper." I gratefully surrendered the heavy device into her eager, grasping hands. I bowed my head submissively, expressing my profound, pathetic gratitude for their supposed kindness and exceptional care. I slowly turned around and began my agonizing, shuffling retreat back toward the massive oak door. I did not ask any dangerous questions. I did not demand to see my isolated daughter. I simply played the thoroughly beaten, completely compliant, senile fool retreating back into the cold, gray shadows. I slowly descended the wide marble steps, dragging my brass cane loudly against the stone, letting them firmly believe they had completely stripped me of all my paternal power. I climbed back into my waiting vehicle, offered the stern security guards one final pathetic wave, and drove smoothly away from their heavily fortified toxic compound. The long drive back to my silent estate felt different. The heavy weight of despair had vanished, replaced by burning anticipation. I parked my car in the garage and walked with swift strides into my house. I bypassed the living areas and descended the hidden staircase leading into my secure study. The windowless room smelled of old paper. I locked the steel door behind me and sat down in the leather chair. A black digital receiver sat on the desk, its green light blinking with a steady pulse. I picked up the heavy headphones, placed them over my ears, and turned the volume dial. The audio feed was live. The crisp audio feeding through my heavy headphones was a revelation. I sat perfectly still in my secure basement study, listening to the frantic, muffled voices echoing inside the golden air purifier I had just planted in the Davies mansion. Preston and Beatrice were no longer playing the refined, grieving family members. They were pacing the hardwood floor of the bedroom, snapping at each other with pure, venomous desperation. Preston was cursing loudly. He was furiously complaining about how difficult it was to bypass Harper's secondary security protocols while she remained unconscious. He needed her voice authorization to transfer the massive funds from her charitable foundation, and his brutal attempt to use her thumbprint had only unlocked her basic social applications. He was entirely locked out of the real money. I listened to the raw panic vibrating in his words until the private encrypted landline on my mahogany desk suddenly rang. I pulled the headphones down around my neck and picked up the receiver. It was Mitchell Reed. My crisis manager did not offer any polite evening pleasantries. He simply told me to unlock the service elevator immediately. He had the package. 20 minutes later, Mitchell walked quietly into my hidden sanctuary. He was not carrying a sleek digital tablet or a simple, discreet flash drive. He was carrying two massive, heavily reinforced cardboard boxes packed tightly with thick paper files. He dropped them onto my desk with a loud, heavy thud that reverberated off the wood-paneled walls. He sat down in the leather guest chair, his sharp silver hair catching the dim light, his face completely devoid of any humor. He looked at me with a grim, clinical intensity. He had successfully peeled back the glamorous, highly polished facade of the entire Davies family, and the toxic rot hiding beneath their expensive clothing was infinitely worse than I could have ever imagined. Mitchell pulled a thick red folder from the top box and slid it across the smooth desk. He told me to brace myself. The illusion of their massive generational wealth was nothing but smoke and mirrors. I opened the heavy file and began reading the undeniable legal documents. Beatrice Davies, the arrogant woman who wore imported designer suits and threw lavish charity galas, was completely and utterly bankrupt. Her sprawling suburban mansion, the magnificent property she constantly bragged about at elite country club luncheons, did not belong to her anymore. It had been quietly foreclosed upon by a major national bank exactly 3 months ago. She was currently facing multiple aggressive lawsuits for unpaid premium credit card debts, severely defaulted personal loans, and 6 months of unpaid private staff wages. She had expertly maintained a flawless social facade, floating desperately on the very last fumes of a dead reputation. She was pretending to be a wealthy, powerful matriarch while actively drowning in a massive sea of inescapable debt. She was a hollow, empty shell, a ruthless parasite actively searching for a wealthy host to sustain her glamorous lifestyle. And she had found the absolute perfect, unsuspecting target in my beautiful daughter. But Beatrice's pathetic financial ruin was absolutely nothing compared to the catastrophic, highly dangerous reality of Preston's life. Mitchell reached into the box and handed me the second, much thicker black folder. I opened it and immediately read the executive summary. Preston Davies was not a highly successful, aggressive venture capital investment fund manager. His prestigious corporate title was a complete, entirely fabricated illusion designed to lure in the wealthy elite. He did not invest money in emerging technology markets or secure commercial real estate developments. He was actively running a massive, highly illegal Ponzi scheme. He had spent the last 5 years aggressively courting wealthy, unsuspecting investors, using their newly deposited capital to pay off his older, increasingly angry clients. He had built a fragile, towering house of cards, and now the entire structure was violently collapsing directly on top of him. He possessed absolutely zero legitimate liquid assets. He only carried massive, crippling financial liabilities. I stared at the banking charts, feeling a cold fury rising in my chest. He was a professional predator who had completely fooled my entire family. Mitchell leaned forward and pointed a long finger at a specific page detailing a series of massive, highly irregular offshore wire transfers. Preston had foolishly decided to gamble with the wrong kind of people. In a frantic, desperate attempt to generate enough quick capital to keep his failing Ponzi scheme afloat, he had quietly borrowed $12 million from a violently ruthless organized crime syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. He had completely lost every single penny of that dangerous money in a series of disastrously stupid overseas investments. The brutal criminal syndicate was no longer politely asking for their money back. They had issued a final, absolute, non-negotiable ultimatum. Mitchell handed me a typed transcript of a recently intercepted phone call. The Las Vegas enforcers had given Preston exactly 10 days to physically produce the missing $12 million. If he failed to secure the funds by the absolute deadline, they solemnly promised to systematically break both of his legs before slowly moving on to much more permanent, highly lethal solutions. Preston was a dead man, walking completely out of time and completely out of options. The terrifying, jagged pieces of the puzzle violently slammed together in my mind with sickening, undeniable clarity. Preston did not marry Harper for love. He married her because she was the sole, uncontested heir to a billion-dollar commercial real estate empire. He married her to gain direct, unfettered access to her massive charitable foundation accounts and her private family trust funds. They were literal parasites who had carefully and methodically targeted a rich host. And now, facing absolute physical destruction at the hands of violent, unforgiving criminals, Preston needed instant, untraceable liquid cash. He needed those millions immediately, and Harper's sudden, tragic medical emergency was his only viable way to steal her massive fortune. He could not wait for her to slowly discover his fraud. He could not risk a lengthy, complicated divorce where forensic accountants would inevitably uncover his massive criminal enterprise and his staggering mob debt. He needed to incapacitate her, gain complete legal and physical control over her medical proxy, and quietly drain her accounts dry while she lay comatose in a heavily guarded room. That is exactly why he violently attacked her in their foyer. That is why he fabricated the ridiculous story about red wine and antidepressants. He was manufacturing a tragic narrative to cover up a highly calculated, incredibly desperate financial execution. I slowly closed the heavy black folder, my hands perfectly still. I did not amass a massive real estate empire by playing fair, and I certainly was not going to play fair now. My daughter was locked inside a fortress with a desperate, cornered rat who had 10 days to pay a mob debt. I looked at Mitchell, feeling the absolute predatory calm settle entirely over my cold soul. We are going to completely destroy his entire miserable life starting right now. I reached for my phone and dialed the first critical number tonight. Done. The first sounds that filtered through the heavy foam of my headphones were chillingly familiar. I heard the slow, rhythmic hum of the medical ventilator and the steady, quiet beeping of my daughter's heart monitor. The high-definition microphone hidden deep inside the golden air purifier captured absolutely everything with terrifying clarity. I could hear the faint rustle of the expensive cotton sheets as Harper shifted slightly in her medically induced sleep. I sat perfectly still in the dim light of my basement study, my hands resting flat on the mahogany desk. I listened to the quiet isolation of the gilded prison Preston had built for her. For nearly an hour, there was nothing but the mechanical rhythm of survival. Then the heavy oak door creaked open. I heard the unmistakable sharp clicking of Beatrice's designer heels striking the hardwood floor, followed immediately by Preston's heavier, deliberate footsteps. The door clicked firmly shut, plunging the room back into a heavy, oppressive intimacy. Beatrice began speaking instantly, her voice stripped of its usual refined, sugary arrogance. She sounded frantic, her words sharp and trembling, with a raw, undeniable panic. She paced the floor like a caged animal. "Preston, we are completely out of time," she hissed, her voice vibrating with genuine terror. "Those monsters from Nevada are not corporate bankers. They do not care about your fabricated investment projections or your smooth apologies. They sent another message to my private phone an hour ago. They know exactly where we live. They know where I sleep. We have exactly 10 days before they send their enforcers to physically collect that $12 million. They are going to butcher us, Preston. They are going to systematically dismantle our entire lives." Preston let out a long, irritated sigh. I could picture him perfectly leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his handsome face twisted in absolute annoyance. "Mother, you need to lower your voice immediately," he commanded, his tone dripping with cold, venomous authority. "The private nurses are stationed just down the hallway. You are letting your irrational anxiety cloud your judgment. I have the entire situation completely under control. We are standing inside the ultimate solution right now. Harper is completely incapacitated. The corrupt doctor has thoroughly documented her severe psychiatric fragility and her supposed substance abuse. The legal foundation for her tragic, unexpected demise is already poured in solid concrete." Beatrice stopped pacing. Her breathing was harsh and ragged in the microphone. "But the biometric locks, Preston," she whispered desperately. "You completely failed to access her primary offshore trust accounts at the hospital. Her thumbprint only unlocked her petty cash and her social applications. We need her conscious voice authorization to transfer the massive sums of money required to pay off the syndicate. We need her awake and compliant. How exactly are you going to force her to speak those authorization codes while she lies there sedated?" I leaned forward in my leather chair, pressing the headphones tighter against my ears. My heart hammered against my ribs. I waited for his answer, knowing it would reveal the absolute depth of his depravity. "I do not need her voice authorization anymore, Mother," Preston said smoothly, his voice taking on a sickening, triumphant edge. "I simply needed access to her phone to intercept the two-factor authentication protocols from her private banking application. I bypassed the voice recognition software by submitting a digital bereavement claim under my name as her lawful husband and medical proxy. I have successfully established temporary emergency control over her primary accounts, but the bank will only allow those massive transfers to clear if she is permanently incapacitated. The estate simply needs to move into the final, inevitable phase of execution." Beatrice let out a sharp, frightened breath. "You cannot just suffocate her with a pillow, Preston. The local police will demand a thorough autopsy if she dies under suspicious circumstances in our own home. Her father is already suspicious. You saw Richard lurking around the emergency room. He is a very dangerous, resourceful man. If the medical examiners find a single shred of physical evidence pointing to foul play, Richard will use his immense wealth to completely destroy us. We will trade a mob execution for a federal prison sentence." A low, dark chuckle echoed through the headphones. It was the sound of a predator perfectly confident in his absolute superiority. "Do you honestly think I would rely on something as clumsy and primitive as physical violence?" Preston asked, his voice filled with arrogant pride. "I am not a common street thug. I have spent the last 3 weeks meticulously preparing for this exact, unavoidable scenario. I anticipated the absolute need for a clean, scientifically flawless resolution." I heard the faint sound of a heavy metal zipper sliding open. Preston was opening a small bag, or a secure carrying case. I reached out to a contact operating deep within the encrypted layers of the dark web. He explained, his words deliberate and terrifyingly calm. "I paid $500,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency to acquire a very specific, incredibly rare synthetic chemical compound. It was originally engineered by foreign military intelligence for covert assassinations. It is a highly concentrated, fast-acting neurotoxin that specifically targets the cardiovascular system. My breath caught in my throat. The air in my basement study suddenly felt freezing cold. I stared blindly at the dark wall, listening to the man who swore to love and protect my daughter casually detail her impending murder. It is completely brilliant in its execution. Preston continued, his tone resembling a proud professor lecturing a student. When introduced into the human bloodstream, the compound mimics the exact physiological symptoms of a massive, catastrophic heart attack. It forcefully triggers a rapid, irreversible failure of the major organs. But the true genius of this specific neurotoxin is its incredibly rapid chemical degradation. Within exactly 2 hours of administration, the synthetic proteins dissolve completely into the blood. It breaks down into trace elements that perfectly match the natural enzymes produced during severe cardiac arrest. It is absolutely 100% undetectable in standard medical toxicology reports. Even if Richard demands a full, independent autopsy, the elite medical examiners will only find the tragic, undeniably natural evidence of sudden heart failure. Beatrice was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was a trembling, fearful whisper. "How are you going to administer it?" "Through her intravenous line," Preston replied. "The private nurses change her bags every 4 hours. Tomorrow night I will inject the exact dosage directly into the medical port. When the alarms trigger, the reaction will be irreversible. The estate transfers to my name. I will wire the stolen money directly to Las Vegas, and we will immediately inherit the entire commercial empire." The absolute paralyzing magnitude of the terrifying horror washed completely over me. This was now a ticking time bomb of cold, premeditated murder. I pulled the heavy headphones down from my ears. My hands balled into tight fists on the mahogany desk. Preston had arrogantly handed the executioner the very rope he needed. It was finally time for this father to forcefully strike back. He would pay for this betrayal. The heavy automatic doors of the emergency bay hissed open once again, slicing through the tense, sterile silence of the waiting room. Preston walked out slowly, his posture meticulously engineered to project the absolute perfect image of an emotionally exhausted, deeply traumatized husband. He spotted me immediately. He adjusted his trajectory, walking directly toward where I stood, leaning heavily on my brass cane. Before I could even register his sudden movement, he closed the remaining distance between us and wrapped his arms around my stiff shoulders. He pulled me into a tight, suffocating, utterly fake embrace. The cloying, expensive scent of his bespoke cologne filled my nostrils completely, masking the harsh chemical smell of the hospital. I forced my rigid muscles to relax. I forced myself to accept the sickening physical contact from the man who had undoubtedly just tried to kill my only child, Dad. I promised to protect her with my life. Preston whispered, his voice trembling with a masterfully calculated, agonizing sorrow that echoed softly against the pale hospital walls. He slowly pulled back, keeping his strong hands firmly planted on my drooping shoulders, and looked deeply into my eyes with a practiced sincerity that made my stomach violently churn. She just desperately needs rest. She needs absolute unbroken quiet so her incredibly fragile mind can finally begin to heal. The doctors are highly concerned about her current mental stability. You really should go home tonight, Dad. Your heart simply cannot take this kind of immense, terrifying stress at your age. Leave her care entirely to me. I will not leave her side for a single second. I will guard her perfectly. He was actively dismissing me. He was cleverly cloaking his ruthless, calculated banishment in the highly deceptive guise of deep familial concern. He wanted me out of the building, far away from Harper, and completely removed from the medical staff. I looked down at his feet. Even in the chaotic, terrifying aftermath of a supposed midnight medical emergency, his expensive Italian leather loafers were impeccably polished. They gleamed brightly under the harsh fluorescent lights, completely devoid of a single scuff or speck of dust. The sight of those flawless shoes instantly transported me back exactly 4 years. My late wife Lillian had explicitly warned me about this exact man during a massive, lavish charity gala we were hosting at our estate. Preston had been busy aggressively charming the entire room full of wealthy investors and powerful politicians. Lillian had gently taken my arm, leaning close to my ear, as her sharp, intuitive eyes scanned his rigid, perfect posture and his bright, heavily practiced smile. She told me to look very closely at his immaculate shoes. She said a man who spends that much time meticulously polishing his footwear right before a supposedly casual charity event cares infinitely more about his own reflection than his actual soul. She told me to look deeply into his face. She said he possessed deeply hollow eyes, the terrifying kind of dark, empty eyes that absorbed all surrounding light, but absolutely never reflected any genuine warmth or empathy back into the world. Lillian was a woman of profound, unmatched intuition. She instantly saw the terrifying, empty void hiding deep inside the handsome, ambitious man courting our daughter. I had foolishly dismissed her valid concerns back then. I stubbornly thought she was just being an overly protective, naturally suspicious mother clinging tightly to her only child. I thought Preston was simply a hungry, highly motivated young professional, eager to thoroughly impress his wealthy, powerful future father-in-law. I had spent 40 long, incredibly difficult years successfully building a massive commercial real estate empire, constantly evaluating complex character traits and sniffing out terrible business investments, yet I had completely missed the toxic, venomous rot hiding deep inside Preston's soul. Now staring directly into those exact same hollow, lifeless eyes, I felt a sickening, heavy wave of intense, crushing guilt wash completely over me. Lillian had been absolutely right about him from the very first moment. The stark, undeniable reality of the horrifying situation crashed over me with brutal, terrifying clarity. Preston was not just playing the calculated role of a deeply concerned, loving husband managing a tragic accident. He was actively, systematically, and ruthlessly trying to completely isolate Harper from the entire outside world. He was rapidly building an invisible, impenetrable fortress around her hospital bed, cleverly utilizing rigid medical protocol and undeniable spousal privilege as his indestructible bricks and mortar. He was the sole gatekeeper to her survival. If I foolishly pushed back right now, if I forcefully demanded to see my daughter immediately or openly accused him of orchestrating this entire nightmare, the steel trap would spring entirely shut. He currently held all the winning legal and medical cards in his carefully manicured hands. As her lawful, legally recognized husband, he possessed the ultimate, unquestionable authority over her visitors and her specialized care. He could simply inform the strict hospital administration that my looming, anxious presence was a dangerous, unpredictable trigger for her incredibly fragile mental state. He could legally restrict my access completely, leaving me absolutely powerless and entirely blind to his next lethal move. I would be swiftly escorted out by armed hospital security, permanently branded by the doctors and the police as a disruptive, unstable, grieving father who simply could not accept the sad reality of his daughter's severe psychiatric breakdown. I would rapidly lose any realistic chance of ever uncovering the dark, violent truth hiding behind his polished, immaculate facade. To absolutely win this impending war, I had to completely surrender this preliminary battle unfolding right here in this fluorescent hallway. I had to swallow my burning pride and let him fully believe he was the smartest, most dominant man in the room. I let my tense shoulders drop forward dramatically, exaggerating the natural stoop of my spine. I allowed a slight, highly noticeable tremor to enter my hands as I leaned much more heavily onto my carved brass cane. I let out a very long, terribly ragged sigh, forcing my aging eyes to look exceptionally watery, completely exhausted, and utterly devastatingly defeated. I had to become the very thing he thought I was. I had to become the helpless, senile old fool. You are absolutely right, Preston. I said, my voice deliberately lowered to a weak, hoarse whisper that perfectly mimicked a broken, shattered spirit. I am just a very tired, very frightened old man tonight. This tragic accident has taken absolutely everything out of me. My chest feels incredibly tight, and I can barely keep my eyes open. I do not think I can physically bear to see my little girl lying in a hospital bed, looking so broken and fragile. It would simply destroy my old heart. I desperately need to trust you to handle this nightmare. I need you to be the remarkably strong, capable man she married. I need you to watch over her for me. Profound relief rapidly washed over Preston's entire face. It was a microscopic shift, a slight relaxation of his tense jaw muscles, and a subtle drop in his shoulders, but I caught it instantly. The arrogant predator foolishly believed the wounded prey had simply given up the fight without firing a single shot. He squeezed my shoulder affectionately one last time, a gesture so laden with fake sympathy, it made my skin crawl. "Do not worry about a single thing, Dad. I have everything completely under control here. Go home. Get some much-needed deep sleep. I will personally call you the absolute second there is any meaningful change in her medical condition. You have my solemn, unbreakable word." I nodded weakly, slowly turning away from him. I shuffled painfully toward the automatic sliding glass doors, intentionally dragging my heavy feet just a little bit against the linoleum. I painted the absolute perfect picture of a frail, beaten father retreating blindly into the freezing, dark, unforgiving Chicago night. Every single step away from that hospital room tore at my soul. I was willingly leaving my helpless, sedated daughter in the direct care of the monster who had undoubtedly put her there. The guilt was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my lungs, but the cold, logical part of my brain knew this was the only viable path forward. I walked out into this biting wind, my knuckles white as I gripped the handle of my cane. Preston thought he had successfully manipulated the board. He thought he had effortlessly removed the final obstacle to his dark, twisted inheritance. He had absolutely no idea that by forcing me into the shadows, he had simply given me the perfect unseen vantage point to orchestrate his total annihilation. I would not rest. I would not sleep. I would gather my vast, unlimited resources and systematically tear his entire manufactured life apart. He had awoken a sleeping giant, and he would soon realize the fatal magnitude of his massive error. I approached my waiting vehicle, the heavy sedan idling smoothly in the circular drop-off zone. My private driver opened the rear door, his face a mask of silent professional concern, but I waved him off. I needed to drive myself tonight. I needed the mechanical, vibrating hum of the powerful engine and the absolute, unbroken solitude of the dark leather interior to properly organize my thoughts. I slid behind the polished steering wheel, the expensive leather creaking softly under my weight. Through the tinted windshield, I took one last lingering look at the glowing, sterile facade of the emergency department. Preston was likely still standing in the lobby congratulating himself on a flawless performance, utterly unaware of the catastrophic storm slowly gathering on his immediate horizon. I shifted the car into gear, the tires whispering against the freezing asphalt. I had successfully played the role of the loving, broken warden handing over the keys. Now, I was the executioner quietly stepping into the dark. I intended to tear the headphones from my ears and set my plan into violent motion, but a sickening gravity kept my hands frozen. I needed to witness the entire depth of the bottomless abyss I was peering into. I pressed the padded ear cups tighter against my skull, letting the audio feed consume my silent study. The harsh hiss of Harper's medical ventilator continued its steady march, serving as a dark metronome for the horrifying conversation unfolding in her gilded prison. Beatrice's voice sliced through the static, her panic replaced by calculating curiosity. "The cardiovascular toxin will provide the final clean exit," she murmured, devoid of empathy. "But what about the preliminary medical foundation? The hospital psychiatrists were incredibly thorough. Are you absolutely certain her cognitive decline cannot be traced back to chemical interference? If the medical examiners look closely at her brain scans, they might notice inconsistencies with the standard psychological breakdown." Preston let out an arrogant sigh. "You constantly underestimate my meticulous preparation, Mother," he stated, his voice dripping with condescending pride. "I have been actively, systematically preparing her physical and mental state for exactly 6 grueling months. The temperature in my hidden sanctuary plummeted. I purchased a highly specialized compound from the dark web. Preston continued, his words chillingly clinical. It is a potent, tasteless, odorless, neurodegenerative chemical designed to aggressively attack the frontal lobe. It methodically degrades delicate brain tissue over an extended period. I have been carefully slipping microdoses of it into her morning coffee and evening tea every day since November. My stomach violently heaved. A wave of pure nausea washed completely over me. Every memory of my daughter from the past 6 months suddenly flashed before my eyes with horrifying clarity. I remembered her uncharacteristic bouts of severe anxiety, the trembling in her hands. In January, her frantic phone calls complaining about vivid, terrifying nightmares and extreme paranoia. I had foolishly attributed it to the overwhelming stress of managing the charitable foundation. She was not stressed. She was being actively poisoned directly in front of my face. The chemical induces severe hallucinations, Preston explained casually. It flawlessly mimics the clinical symptoms of acute treatment-resistant psychosis. By the time I brought her into the emergency room, her delicate mind was shattered. The attending psychiatrists did not suspect foul play because I handed them a weeping, incoherent woman who perfectly fit the diagnostic criteria for a massive psychiatric breakdown. It was a brilliant preliminary strategy, Beatrice purred, practically vibrating with dark approval. But the physical trauma was the ultimate stroke of genius. The severe head injury completely masked the subtle chemical damage on their expensive MRI machines. They simply assumed her cognitive degradation was entirely caused by the fall. Exactly, Preston said, a sickening smile clearly audible in his tone. And that brings us to the grand finale of her unfortunate accident. Do you honestly believe a healthy, athletic woman simply trips over a carpet runner and falls down a perfectly lit grand staircase? My blood turned to freezing ice. I gripped the thick mahogany edge of my desk so tightly, my knuckles instantly turned bone white. She was completely hysterical that night, Preston recounted in a dramatic whisper. The neurodegenerative chemical was peaking in her system. She was screaming about shadows moving in the corners of the hallway. She was standing at the top of the stairs, trembling like a child. I walked up behind her. I did not comfort her. I grabbed her firmly by her fragile shoulders and violently shoved her backward into the empty air. A sharp gasp ripped its way out of my burning throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the horrifying image of my precious daughter tumbling backward into the darkness was permanently burned into my retinas. She hit the marble landing with a loud, satisfying crack, Preston bragged. I stood at the top of the stairs and calmly watched her bleed for exactly 10 minutes before I picked up the phone and performed my frantic husband routine for the dispatchers. The severe physical trauma from the fall provided the perfect medical cover story to explain away her prolonged unconsciousness and psychiatric collapse. The gold air purifier had done its job flawlessly. It delivered the unvarnished truth directly into my ears. But that terrible truth was a corrosive acid actively burning away my civilized restraint. Harper was being tortured under my nose. The man I had welcomed into my home shoved her down a flight of stairs and watched her bleed for his own financial gain. A blinding, violent rage erupted inside my chest. It was a primal fury that completely bypassed my calculating mind. My vision literally swam with a thick red haze. I violently ripped the headphones from my ears and threw them fiercely across the room. They smashed loudly against the wood-paneled wall, shattering into pieces. I lunged up from my leather chair, knocking it backward. I grabbed my solid brass cane. My trembling hands squeezed the cold metal shaft until my joints loudly popped. Every instinct screaming in my burning blood demanded that I storm out of this basement, get into my vehicle, and drive straight through the iron gates of the Davies estate. I wanted to kick down the heavy oak door of their mansion. I wanted to march directly up that grand staircase. I wanted to wrap my bare hands tightly around Preston's throat and squeeze until those hollow, arrogant eyes popped completely out of his skull. I wanted to beat him to death with my cane. I stood in the center of my soundproof study, my chest heaving violently, my breath rasping heavily in the absolute silence. I raised the heavy brass cane into the air, fully intending to smash my mahogany desk into splinters, just to release the overwhelming, suffocating pressure building inside my mind. But as the heavy metal hovered in the air, a sudden ghostly image of Lillian's face appeared. She was looking at me with those sharp, intuitive eyes, silently demanding that I use my intellect, not my anger. If I gave in to this murderous rage tonight, I would undoubtedly kill Preston with my bare hands. I would be instantly arrested for premeditated murder, leaving my fragile daughter entirely defenseless in the greedy, grasping hands of his corrupt mother. Beatrice would inherit everything, and Harper would still die. A quick, violent death was a mercy that Preston did not deserve. He needed to be completely erased. He needed to be stripped of every single asset, every shred of his fake dignity, and left to rot. I slowly lowered the brass cane, pressing the rubber tip firmly against the floor. I forced myself to take a very long, deep, shuddering breath. I actively suppressed the volcanic rage, locking the violent monster back inside its deep vault. I would not let my raw, unpredictable emotions dictate my strategy. The execution was no longer just about recovering my money. It was now a matter of ultimate, undeniable vengeance. I had to orchestrate a legal and financial bloodbath so incredibly spectacular and absolutely terrifying that the Davies family would beg for death long before it finally arrived. The audio feed from the golden air purifier continued to transmit the horrifying depths of their depravity directly into my secure basement study. I sat paralyzed in my heavy leather chair, the thick headphones pressing tightly against my ears, listening as Preston and Beatrice calmly transitioned from discussing murder to meticulously mapping out the legal logistics of their impending financial windfall. The sheer audacity of their hushed conversation made the freezing air in the windowless room feel incredibly thick and completely suffocating. Beatrice, her sharp voice suddenly devoid of the chaotic panic she had exhibited moments earlier, began aggressively inquiring about the specific mechanisms of Harper's private trust fund. She desperately wanted to know exactly how Preston intended to legally bypass the ironclad protections I had meticulously established years ago. I had spent a massive fortune paying the absolute best estate attorneys in the country to build an impenetrable, legally bulletproof financial fortress around my daughter. The trust was structured to be entirely irrevocable, specifically designed to completely block any unauthorized access from greedy fortune hunters, opportunistic spouses, or hostile corporate takeovers. But Preston, heavily armed with his fabricated medical crisis and a dark heart completely devoid of human empathy, had found a catastrophic loophole. He began to eagerly explain his brilliant master plan with the cold, clinical precision of a sociopathic surgeon. He smugly told his mother that standard state inheritance laws were completely useless in this specific scenario because the trust was entirely insulated from normal probate proceedings. However, the towering legal fortress possessed one highly specific, incredibly vulnerable structural weakness. It explicitly allowed for the immediate, uncontested transfer of absolute financial control in the rare event of severe, completely irreversible medical incapacitation. Preston had spent the last 6 agonizing months expertly planting the dark, poisonous seeds of Harper's supposed psychiatric breakdown within the medical community. Now he was eagerly preparing to harvest the terrifying results. He confidently assured a giddy Beatrice that the corrupted medical records were absolutely perfect. They painted a flawless, profoundly tragic picture of a young woman whose fragile mind had shattered under the immense pressure of her demanding philanthropic life. Then he cheerfully delivered the final, most devastating blow of the evening. His sharp voice echoed loudly through the hidden microphone, incredibly confident and chillingly clear. "I am going to massively increase the lethal dosage tomorrow night." He stated, his dark tone completely flat and utterly devoid of natural human mercy. "The chemical compound will permanently override her remaining neurological functions. I am going to put her in a permanent, completely irreversible vegetative state. The elite hospital neurologists will have absolutely no alternative but to declare her entirely legally brain damaged. I am filing the complete heavily expedited medical and financial conservatorship papers first thing on Monday morning at the courthouse. Once a sympathetic federal judge blindly grants me absolute legal authority as her heartbroken husband, I will have immediate unchecked access to her entire $50 million irrevocable trust fund. A sharp, hideous sound vibrated through the digital speakers. It was Beatrice laughing. It was a dark, venomous sound that made my skin violently crawl. "The old man, Caldwell, will drop dead from a fatal heart attack soon anyway," she sneered, her wicked voice dripping with triumphant malice. "His empire is ours, Preston. We have won the ultimate prize." I reached for the heavy crystal whiskey tumbler resting silently on the edge of my polished oak desk. I firmly gripped the thick, faceted glass in my right hand. The volcanic rage I had been desperately fighting to suppress for the past 48 hours finally erupted, completely shattering my civilized restraint. I did not throw the fragile glass against the wall. I did not sweep my desk clear in a dramatic, useless fit of blind anger. I simply closed my hand into a tight, brutal fist and squeezed. I forcefully channeled 40 years of relentless corporate aggression, every ounce of my burning paternal fury, and the agonizing terror of losing my child directly into my tightening grip. The crystal held remarkably firm for one long, trembling second before it completely surrendered to the crushing physical pressure. The thick glass violently shattered inside my bare hand with a loud, sickening crunch. Sharp, jagged crystalline shards sliced deeply into my palm, brutally biting into the flesh and viciously tearing through the upper layers of skin. I felt the sudden hot rush of thick blood pooling in the center of my closed hand, but I did not release my iron grip for a single fraction of a second. I eagerly welcomed the piercing physical pain. It was a brilliant, profoundly necessary biological anchor, holding my chaotic mind firmly attached to objective reality. The intense, burning agony cut entirely through the blinding red haze clouding my peripheral vision, but instantly focusing my racing thoughts with terrifying crystal clarity. I slowly, deliberately opened my trembling hand. Brilliant, thick crimson droplets of warm blood fell steadily from my severely torn palm, landing heavily on the pristine surface of my polished oak desk. I silently stared at the bright red stains rapidly blooming across the dark wood grain. The agonizing time for quietly hiding in the cold shadows was officially over. The necessary time for carefully gathering secretive intelligence and patiently playing the pathetic role of the broken, senile father had completely evaporated the exact second Preston set a definitive, lethal deadline for my beautiful daughter's life. He was actively planning to administer the final devastating dose of the black market neurotoxin tomorrow night in his guarded mansion. The violent Las Vegas criminal syndicate had given him exactly 10 short days to produce their stolen $12 million, but my own critical timeline was infinitely shorter. I currently possessed less than 24 fleeting hours to properly execute a flawless, overwhelmingly brutal tactical extraction and safely rescue my daughter from permanent, irreversible neurological destruction. I reached carefully across the heavily blood-stained oak desk with my uninjured left hand and picked up my highly secure, heavily encrypted private phone. I dialed Mitchell Reed's private emergency number. He answered the secure line on the very first ringing tone, his deep voice incredibly sharp and completely alert. "Mitchell, the established parameters of our current investigative engagement have just drastically accelerated," I said, my quiet voice deliberately dropping into a cold, incredibly hollow register. "Preston Davies intends to permanently incapacitate Harper tomorrow night to secure an expedited $50 million financial conservatorship on Monday. I urgently need a fully armed private tactical medical extraction team stationed entirely out of sight, directly near the outer security perimeter of the Davies estate by tomorrow evening. I also critically need your absolute best forensic accountants to immediately begin the highly aggressive process of completely freezing every single digital financial asset connected to the Davies family name. I want those two evil monsters to wake up tomorrow morning completely bankrupt, utterly defenseless, and entirely surrounded by invisible, lethal enemies." We are no longer simply observing the hostile enemy camp from a distance. The deadly hunting season officially begins right now, and I am personally going to completely ruthlessly burn their pathetic gilded fortress entirely to the ground. The morning sun hung bright and high in the freezing Chicago sky, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the sprawling city. I did not bother with my brass cane today. My spine was perfectly straight, and my posture radiated the rigid, dangerous authority of a man who had spent 4 decades commanding absolute obedience. The bandages tightly wrapped around my right hand throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a constant grounding reminder of the violent promise I had made to myself the previous night. I sat in the back of my armored black sport utility vehicle, leading a highly coordinated, incredibly lethal convoy directly toward the Davies estate. Behind my vehicle rolled a state-of-the-art, fully equipped private medical ambulance, staffed by 2 elite trauma surgeons I had flown in entirely off the record. Beside me sat 4 heavily armed, highly specialized private security contractors. They were massive, silent men, wearing tactical body armor over dark suits, their faces completely devoid of any emotion. They were not mere bodyguards. They were a rapid response extraction team, and they understood their explicit, highly lucrative orders perfectly. We were going to breach the compound, neutralize any physical resistance, and retrieve my daughter. We arrived at the towering iron gates of the Davies mansion precisely at noon. The broad daylight stripped away all the dark, intimidating shadows of their suburban fortress, revealing it for exactly what it was: a pathetic, hollow shell built on massive debt and grotesque lies. The 2 armed private security guards stationed at the front gate stepped out of their heated booth, raising their hands in a firm, authoritative gesture, fully expecting my driver to stop and beg for permission to enter. I simply tapped the thick, bulletproof glass separating the front cab from the rear passenger compartment. My driver did not slow down. He accelerated smoothly, forcing the massive, reinforced steel grille of our heavy vehicle directly through the center of the decorative iron gates. The heavy metal violently buckled and shrieked, groaning loudly, as the locking mechanism completely shattered under the tremendous kinetic force. The 2 arrogant gatekeepers instantly dove out of the way, tumbling desperately onto the manicured winter frost. They were completely neutralized by their own sheer terror before my tactical team even had to step out of the vehicle. The black sport utility vehicle slid to an aggressive halt directly in front of the sweeping marble steps of the grand entrance. The private ambulance parked sharply behind us, its rear doors already swinging open. My 4 tactical contractors moved with breathtaking synchronized speed. They poured out of the vehicle, instantly fanning out and forcefully securing the immediate perimeter. 2 of the massive men seamlessly flanked me as I walked up the wide marble steps. I did not bother knocking on the heavy oak door. One of my contractors raised a heavy steel breaching ram and shattered the custom locking mechanism with a single deafening strike. The massive door violently flew open, crashing loudly against the interior wall of the echoing foyer. I stepped over the splintered wood, leaving the pathetic, trembling disguise of the frail, senile grandfather, completely buried in the cold dirt outside. I was the executioner, and I had finally arrived to collect my precious blood. Beatrice came running out of the formal dining room, her sharp designer heels clicking frantically against the polished marble floor. Her perfectly manufactured, glamorous facade was completely shattered by the sudden explosive violence of our entry. She stopped dead in the center of the massive foyer, her dark, venomous eyes widening in absolute paralyzing horror as she took in the sight of the heavily armed men securing her home. Preston appeared on the upper landing of the grand staircase, freezing in place as he looked down at the tactical nightmare unfolding in his pristine hallway. I ignored him entirely. I simply pointed a steady, commanding finger up toward the master suite. 2 of my silent armored contractors immediately rushed up the sweeping staircase, effortlessly pushing past Preston's rigid, trembling body as they made their way directly into my daughter's room. Beatrice finally found her voice. It was a high, shrill shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. "What is the meaning of this insanity?" she screamed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. You cannot just break into my home like a common thug. Get these armed monsters out of my house right now. I am calling the local police this very second. I am having you arrested for armed home invasion and kidnapping. You belong in a prison cell, you psychotic old fool." I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of fear or hesitation. I stood perfectly still, watching her hysterical meltdown with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying insect. My two tactical contractors returned to the top of the staircase. One of them carried the limp, unconscious body of my beautiful daughter, gently cradling her fragile form in his massive protective arms. He carefully carried her down the marble steps, moving swiftly past Beatrice and carrying Harper directly out the shattered front door toward the waiting private ambulance. The other contractor followed closely behind him. He was carrying the heavy solid gold custom air purifier I had personally delivered to the mansion just 3 days ago. He walked directly over to me and silently handed me the gleaming, luxurious machine. I gripped the heavy gold casing firmly with my uninjured left hand. I looked deeply into Beatrice's frantic, terrified eyes. She stopped screaming, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared at the expensive gift. I raised the heavy gold machine high into the air and forcefully threw it down onto the polished marble floor with every single ounce of physical strength I possessed. The heavy metal casing hit the hard stone with a sickening, explosive crunch. The expensive gold plating violently shattered, ripping completely apart, to reveal the dense, complex, military-grade circuitry carefully hidden deep inside. Buried within the shattered wreckage, a small, vibrant green light blinked with a steady, relentless pulse. Beatrice stared at the blinking green light, her entire body suddenly going completely rigid. The color rapidly drained from her sharp face, leaving her skin a ghastly, translucent white. Her jaw dropped open in silent, absolute horror as her brain finally processed the catastrophic magnitude of the shattered machine. "Call them." I whispered, my voice completely devoid of any human mercy, slicing effortlessly through the freezing silence of the grand foyer. "Call the police right now, Beatrice. Pick up the phone and invite the authorities into this house, because I have 72 hours of explicit, heavily encrypted digital audio documenting you and your pathetic son admitting to systematically poisoning my daughter. I have your detailed, premeditated plans to induce a permanent vegetative state." The invisible, crushing weight of reality slammed into Beatrice. Her knees buckled violently beneath her. She collapsed heavily onto the cold marble floor in pure terror. Harper was extracted safely. I walked away, leaving their ruined kingdom completely ablaze. The executioner had successfully rescued his precious child from the dark, cold shadows today. I left the shattered remains of my golden Trojan horse on the marble floor and walked out into the freezing afternoon air. My daughter was safely secured inside the private ambulance, receiving immediate world-class medical care to reverse the toxic chemical damage. The extraction was utterly flawless. But my terrible work was not yet complete. The executioner still had one final, extremely public appointment to keep. That evening, the grand ballroom of the magnificent Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago was completely overflowing with the absolute wealthiest, most influential members of the city elite. It was the highly anticipated annual winter charity gala for Harper's Foundation. Preston had foolishly decided to proceed with the lavish event, aggressively utilizing his wife's tragic medical condition to perfectly position himself as the brave, dedicated husband carrying the heavy torch of her philanthropic legacy. He needed this highly publicized gala to firmly establish his unshakable social dominance right before he officially filed the lethal conservatorship papers on Monday morning. I stood silently in the dark, velvet-draped shadows of the backstage wings, watching the sickening performance unfold. My incredibly sharp, highly expensive legal team had completely hijacked the entire audiovisual control room 20 minutes prior. Preston stood confidently at the grand crystal podium, bathed in a brilliant, warm spotlight. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored black tuxedo that hugged his shoulders perfectly. He looked out over the glittering sea of billionaires, politicians, and socialites with an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. He leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing through the massive gilded hall with a masterfully calibrated, trembling vulnerability. He spoke eloquently about the devastating fragility of life. He spun a beautiful, completely fictitious narrative about how my precious daughter Harper was currently fighting a desperate, heartbreaking battle against a sudden, mysterious neurological decline. He dabbed at his dry eyes with a pristine white silk handkerchief, asking the entire audience for their continued financial support and their deepest prayers during this incredibly agonizing family crisis. The wealthy crowd sat in absolute captivated silence, completely mesmerized by his brilliant toxic lies. They hung on his every single deceptive word, practically weeping for the handsome, tragic hero standing bravely before them. He was basking in the glowing warmth of their ignorant sympathy, thoroughly enjoying his final moment of absolute social supremacy. He was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic storm about to obliterate his entire existence. I stepped smoothly out of the dark shadows and walked directly onto the brightly lit stage. I did not use my brass cane. My stride was incredibly firm, commanding, and radiating absolute, undeniable authority. The sudden movement caught the attention of the crowd, causing a wave of confused murmurs to quickly ripple across the massive ballroom. Preston turned his head, his confident, handsome face instantly freezing into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His hollow eyes widened slightly as he recognized my straight posture and my cold, unyielding expression. I walked directly up to the crystal podium and firmly gripped the microphone stand. I did not offer him a single glance. I looked out at the sea of confused faces and spoke with a booming, thunderous voice that commanded absolute, terrified silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my tone echoing with deadly precision, "my son-in-law has painted a deeply moving picture tonight. However, I feel it is absolutely necessary to provide the complete, unvarnished truth regarding my daughter's sudden medical emergency." Preston finally found his voice, stepping forward, with a frantic, forced smile, desperately trying to salvage his crumbling narrative. "Richard, please," he stammered, reaching out a trembling hand. "This is not the time or the place. Your grief is clearly clouding your mind." I turned to look at him, letting the absolute freezing contempt in my soul shine brightly in my eyes. "I am not grieving, Preston," I stated coldly, my voice carrying clearly through the massive speakers. "I am hunting." I raised my hand and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the hijacked control room, stationed high above the ballroom floor. Instantly, the massive, high-definition projection screens flanking the grand stage flickered brightly to life. Instead of the planned, heartwarming video montage of Harper's charitable achievements, the screens aggressively displayed a series of damning, highly classified documents. The first image was a stark, undeniable bank foreclosure notice bearing Beatrice Davies's name, completely exposing her pathetic suburban bankruptcy. The wealthy crowd gasped in unison as the undeniable proof of their financial ruin was laid bare for the entire city to witness. Then the screen violently shifted to a complex, terrifying financial schematic. It clearly detailed Preston's massive crumbling Ponzi scheme, highlighting the devastating $12 million debt he owed directly to a highly violent organized crime syndicate in Las Vegas. The murmurs in the crowd escalated into a frantic, buzzing panic. Preston took a terrified, staggering step backward, his flawless composure completely shattered. He looked wildly toward the exits like a trapped rat, desperately searching for an escape route. But my private security contractors were already firmly blocking every single door in the ballroom. The final image flashed onto the giant screens. It was a stark green digital audio waveform, accompanied by the highly detailed, heavily encrypted dark web transaction receipts for the rare military-grade neurotoxin. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, horrifying silence as the crisp, unmistakable audio recording of Preston's voice violently echoed from the massive surround sound speakers. The cold, calculating words he had spoken in the privacy of his mansion just 24 hours ago now condemned him publicly. "I am going to massively increase the lethal dosage tomorrow night," the recorded voice declared, dripping with arrogant malice. "I am going to put her in a permanent, completely irreversible vegetative state. I am filing the complete, heavily expedited medical and financial conservatorship papers first thing on Monday morning." The collective gasp that erupted from the Chicago elite was utterly deafening. It was a visceral, horrifying sound of absolute shock and profound revulsion. Prominent billionaires, respected judges, and powerful politicians stared at the stage in absolute terror, completely comprehending the monumental, monstrous evil standing right in front of them. The glittering charity gala had instantly transformed into a brutal, undeniable public execution. Preston stood completely paralyzed at the edge of the stage, his face draining of all color, his entire body trembling violently under the crushing, undeniable weight of his exposed crimes. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, desperate lie, but no words came out. The overwhelming magnitude of his absolute destruction had entirely robbed him of his breath. I turned to face him, fully stepping closer, until I was mere inches from his terrified, sweating face. "I promised to protect my daughter from every predator in this world," I whispered quietly, making absolutely sure the sensitive microphone captured my final, devastating words. "You foolishly thought I was a weak, senile old man. You thought you could bleed my family dry and casually murder my only child for a few $1,000,000. You forgot that I built my empire by destroying men infinitely smarter and infinitely more dangerous than you will ever be. The game ends now." The profound silence holding the grand ballroom hostage finally shattered, instantly replaced by a deafening chorus of panicked shouts and horrified gasps from the glittering crowd. Preston stared at me for one agonizing, suspended second. His hollow eyes were wide with the primal terror of a trapped animal realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. The flawless, arrogant mask he had worn for years dissolved into pure, sweaty desperation. He violently spun away from the crystal podium, practically knocking over a towering floral arrangement as he lunged toward the grand marble steps of the stage. He did not care about his reputation anymore. He did not care about the hundreds of billionaires and politicians watching his spectacular downfall. He only cared about saving his own miserable life. He scrambled down the stairs aggressively, shoving past a group of stunned socialites and knocking a tray of champagne flutes out of a waiter's trembling hands. The crystal glasses shattered loudly against the polished floor, but Preston did not even break his frantic stride. He sprinted frantically toward the heavy double doors of the rear exit, his polished Italian leather loafers slipping slightly on the spilled champagne. He actually believed he could simply run away from the catastrophic devastation he had meticulously orchestrated. He reached the massive brass-handled doors and threw his entire body weight against the heavy wood, desperate to escape into the freezing Chicago night. The heavy wooden doors did not budge. They were firmly locked from the outside. Preston slammed his shoulder against the solid frame again, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper of absolute panic. He clawed frantically at the brass handles, his breathing coming in short, ragged, hyperventilating gasps. Suddenly, the deep velvet-draped shadows completely concealing the emergency alcove shifted. Mitchell Reed stepped smoothly out of the darkness, blocking the only remaining path to salvation. My head of security looked massive in his dark tactical suit, his broad shoulders easily filling the entire width of the exit corridor. His expression was completely blank, radiating the cold, terrifying competence of a man who had ended lives in foreign combat zones before breakfast. Preston stumbled backward, his chest heaving violently as he looked up at the towering human wall standing firmly in his way. Mitchell did not reach for a weapon. He did not raise his hands in a fighting stance. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket and slowly pulled out a sleek, completely unbranded black leather folder. He extended his massive arm silently, offering the dark dossier to the trembling, broken man cowering before him. Preston stared at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake, his shaking hands refusing to reach out and take it. I walked slowly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, parting the sea of horrified, whispering elite, like a dark, unstoppable tide. The terrified attendees actively shrank back as I passed, giving me a wide, respectful berth. I approached the rear exit with a slow, deliberate, incredibly heavy stride, letting the terrifying silence of my approach utterly consume Preston's fragile nerves. He was backed entirely into the corner, his expensive tuxedo ruined with sweat, staring at me with the wide, weeping eyes of a completely broken coward. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him. Mitchell calmly dropped the sleek black folder directly onto the polished floor at Preston's trembling feet. The heavy leather slapped the marble with a dull, highly satisfying thud. I looked down at the pathetic creature who had dared to touch my daughter. You owed the violent Las Vegas criminal syndicate exactly $12 million. I stated, my voice incredibly calm, smoothly overriding the panicked murmurs of the surrounding crowd. Past tense. I carefully watched his eyes dart toward the black folder, a new, completely different kind of absolute terror slowly washing over his sweating face. I bought your entire debt this very afternoon, I whispered, leaning in close so he could perfectly hear the lethal promise in my tone. I paid them every single penny you owed them, effectively transferring the absolute ownership of your miserable soul directly to me. You do not owe the mob anymore, Preston. You owe me. And I do not take cash. The crushing, suffocating reality of his completely inescapable doom finally broke his legs. Preston let out a loud, pathetic sob, his knees violently buckling beneath him as he collapsed heavily onto the hard marble floor. He fell entirely to his knees, burying his weeping face in his trembling hands. He wept loudly, a miserable, broken, incredibly ugly sound that echoed pathetically across the grand ballroom. Beatrice suddenly pushed her way through the thick crowd of stunned onlookers. She had been sitting at a highly exclusive VIP table near the front, foolishly expecting to bathe in the glorious, sympathetic spotlight of her son's tragic speech. Now she stumbled toward us, her expensive diamond necklace sparkling uselessly against her pale, horrified neck. She saw her golden child weeping openly on the floor, surrounded by the undeniable proof of their joint murderous conspiracy. She stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured hands flying up to cover her trembling mouth as the full, devastating weight of my financial and legal annihilation crashed down upon her. She looked at me, her dark eyes silently begging for a mercy she entirely lacked the capacity to give. I simply stared back, offering her nothing but the freezing, bottomless void of my absolute, undeniable vengeance. The hunting season was over, and I had successfully mounted their metaphorical heads permanently on my wall. Before Beatrice could utter a single desperate word, the heavy double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom violently flew open. A massive, heavily armed tactical team wearing dark windbreakers with thick, bright yellow letters spelling FBI boldly across their backs stormed aggressively into the glittering hall. Mitchell had personally alerted the federal authorities exactly 30 minutes ago, providing them with a highly secure, heavily encrypted digital package containing every single piece of undeniable, legally binding evidence I had meticulously gathered. The stern federal agents moved with breathtaking, highly coordinated speed, instantly securing the massive room and loudly commanding the panicked crowd to step completely back. A squad of armed agents marched forcefully down the center aisle, their heavy tactical boots thundering loudly against the polished marble floor. They reached the corner where Preston knelt weeping. 2 massive agents grabbed him roughly by his expensive tuxedo jacket, forcefully hauling him upward and aggressively slamming him against the wood-paneled wall. The sharp, heavy metallic clicking of steel handcuffs tightly locking around his wrists echoed beautifully through the massive hall. Another pair of stern agents aggressively flanked Beatrice. She shrieked loudly, violently, fighting against their firm grip as they swiftly pulled her arms completely behind her back and locked her in heavy steel chains. The bright, blinding flashes of dozens of press cameras wildly illuminated the grand ballroom as the local media ruthlessly captured the ultimate spectacular humiliation of the notorious Davies family being violently dragged out in absolute disgrace. I watched them leave completely satisfied that I had successfully saved my precious daughter. Exactly 6 months have passed since that spectacular night. Preston and his mother Beatrice are currently serving consecutive life sentences in federal prison, entirely stripped of their stolen wealth and thoroughly broken by the very justice system they sought to manipulate. Their pathetic downfall was swift, brutal, and absolutely permanent. The massive Chicago estate they once paraded as their own was forcefully liquidated, the proceeds entirely redirected into the charitable foundation. Today, the biting winter wind has surrendered to a gentle summer breeze. Harper sits quietly beside me on the expansive balcony of my downtown penthouse, looking out over the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. She is completely, wonderfully recovered. The dark shadows that once haunted her beautiful eyes have been permanently erased, replaced by a fierce, undeniable strength she inherited directly from her mother. She takes a slow sip of her warm herbal tea, her hand perfectly steady, the terrifying tremors completely gone. Our bond, once tested by deceit and poison, is now entirely unbroken, forged anew, and heavily tempered by the fire we walked through together. We sit in a comfortable, companionable silence, watching the tiny white sails of yachts gliding across the vibrant blue water. I lean forward, resting my forearms against the cold glass railing, and look deeply at the massive, sprawling city I successfully conquered over 4 decades of relentless battles. I reach into my tailored jacket pocket, pulling out a heavy set of brass keys, the master keys to my entire commercial real estate empire. I place them gently on the table between us. Next time your phone rings at 2 a.m, you do not need to call me, I tell her, my voice thick with absolute pride. Because now you know how to pull the trigger yourself. We both smile together. Betrayal often wears the comforting mask of love and concern. The most dangerous predators are not the ones lurking in dark alleys, but the ones sitting at your dinner table smiling brightly while actively plotting your absolute ruin. As a parent, your intuition is your sharpest weapon. Never ignore the quiet signs of fear in the eyes of your child, and never mistake patience for weakness. Real power is not about being loud. It is about observing in silence, gathering absolute proof, and striking only when you can entirely dismantle the threat. Protect your blood and banish the greedy parasites. Have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be a wolf in a sheep disguise? How did you finally uncover their horrible lies? Share your story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more thrilling tales of justice. See you soon.